Welcome to the Geekbits Podcast with your hosts, Mike, David, and Craig. Hello and welcome to the Geekbits Podcast, episode number 7. So I'm David. As always, we have Mike and Craig here with us as well. The name of this episode is What If Technology Had Stalled in the 80s? And so I wanted to explain a little bit about this, just a thought experiment, and it's kind of interesting. I had this thought. I'm like, well, what if like silicon chip technology or integrated circuits or whatever just simply, for whatever technological or physics reason, they just couldn't make them or never figured out how to make them any smaller or faster. And so we were kind of stuck, at least from a hardware perspective, we were kind of stuck in like 1982, like Commodore 64 type computers, right? And now we could approach this later and say, well, what about 1985? Because now we got 16-bit computers, or we could go 1995, we got 32-bit computers, or whatever. But just to start off, we just wanted to talk about, let's say, 1982. Now, when I say this, I don't necessarily mean we couldn't continue to develop new kinds of software or new applications for hardware.
You're just saying they'd be limited to the hardware of that time.
Right, yeah. Right. So whatever people could figure out to do. And so there's a number of technologies that we take for granted today, and I wanted to discuss, just kind of go through a list of things or anything we can think of and say, hey, would this be possible today with this kind of technology? So one perfect example is this podcast we're doing right now. Could something like this be done on that type of technology? What do you think?
Well, I was sitting here I'm like, wow, all of the possibilities. And I was sitting here kind of thinking about what you were saying. And it depends. I mean, like even the equipment, like we have a podcast mixer board over here that has more processing power than most computers of the 80s. So sure. Now, granted, I understand, you could make this much simpler, and it could be all analog, and there's different ways that we could go about that. But I think overall the answer is probably yes, that the podcast could be done. Then we have to talk about how does it get transmitted. Sure. I think that's probably the bigger problem because back then we had 300 baud modems.
And so that's one of the very next things I wanted to talk about is modem technology was really a kind of a, I don't even know the right word. It existed because they needed something to make use of the existing telecom network that we had, which was analog. It doesn't mean they couldn't have built a digital broadband network.
Agreed. And actually, I was going to go into this, and I didn't, but I guess I'll go ahead and say it now. And that was, they actually did have podcasts back in the day. They were called radio stations, and they had DJs, and they put it all analog. It was all over AM, FM, signals. Yeah. So yes, I mean, but I was trying to stay true to what your original
through a computer system.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So I think we definitely could have increased. I don't know exactly how fast it would have been, but if you could have had the phone company bringing a digital line to your house just for a computer, which there wasn't enough demand for that kind of thing, and for the phone companies to invest effort to build something like that in like 1982. But I absolutely think that by today, like 2021, it would have happened. I think you would have the option of some kind of digital. I don't know when ISDN lines came
That's out. Actually funny you say that. I'm actually Googling. I want to know 1980. So it was standardized in 1980, and it became a actual product in production offered by the phone companies by 1988.
So what was the bandwidth on ISDN?
128K.
Yeah.
Okay.
So with 128K,
significantly better.
Pumped into your Commodore 64 or your Apple II, you'd be able to transfer stuff pretty quickly. You wouldn't have a lot of processing power for codecs, like for compression or something. So real-time stuff would be very challenging, but I think, I think you'd absolutely be able to do things like social media, Amazon, eBay.
What about photography though? Photography, like video, is not going to happen. Period.
No, I don't think so.
I was thinking about that. 4 pixels by 4 pixels.
I was thinking about that before the podcast. We did have sort of kind of digital cameras back then. I mean, we did have CCDs, and we did have capture devices that could bring pictures into a computer. Granted, they weren't very good, but you could do it. And I think it could have been improved upon if they were purpose built for that purpose. So basically like a webcam, you plug into the user port of your Commodore or something, and you could probably take some grayscale images or something like that.
At the very least, you could maybe have a profile picture on your
Yeah.
BBS or your ISDN based network, and
Right,
be
but-
able to transmit that. But
You know-
full color video.
Well, even
built
full
in.
color pictures, like the Apple II and the Commodore 64 had, I forget, 16 colors, but there were color cells involved. So I can't remember. You'd probably know if
Yeah.
you had, but it's not going to be a very colorful picture. Even
Were there IBM compatible computers in the 80s that would have had better video cards or something?
Not in '82 when we were theoretically talking about this.
you had
they had a ball.
CGA, 4-color CGA,
Yeah.
Right.
So
which would have been like pink and green. Very terrible color. The palette. Whoever came up with that color palette.
not to
Oh,
say,
yeah, brutal.
Of course, not to say that again. I mean, not to say they couldn't have improved upon that. I mean, a lot of these types of technologies were the way they were just for cost or for some other reason. So not to say they couldn't have improved upon that in the coming years without needing newer hardware.
Well, and that brings up another interesting point too. So, the Commodore 64 or the Apple II or the IBM XT that was sitting on your desk at home could have been more powerful, even with the same processor, by making it a whole lot bigger. Right? You could
a whole lot more
you could put a
expensive.
whole lot more RAM in it and a whole lot more. But yes, it would have raised the cost significantly. So part of the problem of the time was a cost issue,
Right.
and a space issue, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to have one room of your house dedicated to your mainframe or something.
Well, I mean, what if a lot of people went that route? What if because we're stuck in the 80s, what if every room, it was assumed every house was going to be built with the ISDN line pumped straight to a particular room, and somebody had almost like a mini mainframe in order to have. So instead of the
that's
computers getting
fascinating.
smaller,
Well, because-
the houses started to accommodate bigger devices because that's the only way to get more power.
Well, this exact thing has happened with other technologies. So, for example, the home theater room, like almost every house I don't think you can buy a new house today that doesn't have a theater room in it, right?
Right.
And so, I guess the same thing would be true for this. If the world had to evolve around this technology and we wanted to keep advancing, then maybe we would have to have dedicated spaces for our
Yeah, kind of like
technology.
we started adding, closets for air conditioners and stuff like that. You could have a computer closet that housed your home computer, mini computer or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And
a second air conditioner to keep it cool.
But I'm curious, like maybe you know this, David. Would you, since you couldn't make the processors faster, could you do like what we're doing now? Because we're hitting bottlenecks on just because of the laws of physics, we can't get the devices much smaller. So everybody's probably noticed we have 6 and 8 core laptops and stuff.
They were already doing that back then with like Cray and other types of supercomputers and stuff had multiple processors, so it was certainly possible.
So maybe people would start having those in their computer closet in their house, where they had,
The question is, for me, is more around what drives that, right?
Sure.
So, because the average Joe, let's maybe even back up for just a second too, because the average Joe didn't in the 80s again. Remember, just think of that mindset. The average Joe didn't even know what a computer was, much less have any use for one. So something would have to drive the adoption beyond just the fact that it was quote cool.
Yeah, so that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. So, there's been a number of things that have happened over the last 30 to 40 years that are not just technological change, but are things we can attribute to society and cultural. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that. Like, what drove the massive computer spike of the late 90s? I mean, we went from a time in like 1994, for example, where basically only few people still had computers. I mean, just, the hobbyists and people who needed them for business and whatnot. By 6 years later, by 2000, everybody had a computer. And I think the internet was the driving factor behind that.
The internet really gave me my job. That's how I got started in IT. It was really because of the internet, because computers had become so ubiquitous, and because there was this platform on the internet, and I got into web development. I knew a little programming before that through BASIC on the Commodore and in school and Pascal and stuff like that. But the internet's what really drove the job market for web development and web programming.
And of course, the internet had been around since I think the 70s or something like that, or 60s or 70s, something like that.
We should have looked this up because we talked about it in the last podcast.
But anyway, nevertheless, it was certainly around in 1982.
For if you were in the military or in a university type setting, then it was around.
Right. So the question is, if it would have evolved to some extent like it did without the rapid hardware advancement that we had as well. And again, I think absolutely with a broadband connection to your home, it wouldn't be the exact same experience, but you could have, email and social media and, like I said, stuff like Amazon, like online shopping and eBay and Craigslist and, all that kind of stuff. I think you could have at least similar.
It would just probably look a lot.
It would look different. The interface
primitive.
would be different. The pictures would be either non-existent or very cartoonish looking. But it could be done absolutely. And I think a lot of the same functionality would be there.
It is interesting as somebody who has a pretty big background in e-commerce. A lot of the things that we look at today is, how fast does the page load and stuff like that, because it's true that conversion rates in e-commerce, if the page loads faster, you sell more product, right? But people would just have to have, and quite honestly, we know they did have a lot more patience for those types of things. If it was even with a slower computer.
I'm thinking of just locally, just like loading something off of a tape drive or a floppy disk.
Right.
Where is that patience that I had as a kid?
It's gone.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that could help with some of that is if you were a frequent subscriber. Let's say that there was an Amazon of the 80s, right? And it was all based on those slower computers and the slow graphics and all that. There is the possibility too. Again, you have this hopefully we have this ISDN technology or something similar to it that evolved. They give us a little bit more than 300 baud or 1200 baud or something like that. You could also have some kind of nightly batch process that okay, I'm a frequent shopper of Amazon, and Amazon has a feed, and every night it comes down, sort of like we talked about FidoNet in our last BBS video, because I think the world was already kind of headed that way anyway. So maybe there was I guess you'd have to have a bunch of floppies stacked up, but some kind of caching system that would.
Well, hang on. In 1982, were there hard drives that had any storage space? Hard drive?
Absolutely.
So, again, if you had the closet computer, the closet mainframe, maybe you had a rack of hard drives like or at least the wealthy people did, and they preloaded all the icons and images.
I don't think that would be necessary. I mean, a 128K connection, it would be plenty to download that kind of stuff. I mean, keep in mind the size of these images would be so much smaller because of the type of graphics system that you'd be putting them on. And, I'd like to bring up an interesting point.
I'm thinking early days of the internet, like Netscape Navigator and things like that. When you got me started on the internet in 96, there was still a lot of caching going on in your web browser. And we still have that today. Like it's still important. So I feel like with the limited hardware of that time, caching would have become a big deal.
I think it would have.
And people would have had to have this,
maybe
this little bit of this.
But I'd like to bring up an interesting example. I remember a time not too long ago. I mean, I guess it was a while. But, we're talking over 10 years ago, probably around like 2006 or whatever. I used to sit in my recliner in the living room with my iBook G3 and use Facebook. And you know what? It ran perfectly fine on there. And then about 2 or 3 years later, Facebook did something to their website. I don't know if they added more scripting or something like that, but it got to where it was so abhorrently slow if you weren't using a faster computer. It was miserable. And today, if I tried to log on to Facebook with a G3 computer, it'd probably take 5 minutes just to pull up the page and display like my news feed or whatever. I mean, and the reality is, like, if you take a screenshot of Facebook today and compare it to a screenshot from, say, 13, 14 years ago, it doesn't look all that different.
I probably could offer a little bit of insight on that since I have a background in web development.
I think I know, but I'm dying to hear you.
Well, before you explain why, the main point I just wanted to drive home was that, obviously the services would be optimized for the technology that we had. And so if everybody had a slow computer, the services would be designed around that.
Right.
But anyway, what were you going to say?
So part of the reason, and I hear this complaint all the time from, my mother-in-law and, elderly people and that hang on to older computers and things like that. Like, why does this no longer work on this laptop I bought 15 years ago? And a lot of it is we are demanding of our websites things that we didn't demand of them 10 or 20 years ago. And so you kind of alluded to it. You said the scripting. And it's not like Facebook or Google or, any of these platforms are just like, let's throw more JavaScript and be lazy about how they're programming. We're wanting stuff to be more interactive. So when I scroll down, like one of the early things was as you scroll in the news feed, more things bubble up.
Yeah, lazy
notifications pop up that didn't used to do that without like a full page refresh. So it really goes back like to the early mid 2000s with Google coming up with Ajax. You guys, I'm sure, heard of Ajax technology, where the page isn't getting completely reloaded every time. The script is going and, fetching new data and changing bits and pieces of the page in real time as you're interacting with it. Whereas the early days, when I first started getting into the web programming, every time you did a click, wipe out the entire page
and reload all the data,
recalculate all the data, and reload all the whole user interface with the new data into the page. That has been a big evolution.
What do you get, the document object model or something like? Anyway,
very nice.
See, I know a little bit of this stuff. Yeah. So the other thing, Dom. So the other thing too that we've added, I've noticed, is there's a whole lot of UI stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with the way the page looks, but the way the page behaves. And I'll give you an example of that I think you'll easily respond to, and that is like rubber banding. You scroll all the way to the bottom, and the page kind of bounces and then comes back, right? That's the kind of stuff that's taking up all of that code space now.
All these little niceties and stuff. And I think this is why I thought the caching thing might be important, because I think we would have probably wanted those interactions. And it's actually kind of interesting because like mainframes worked the way the early internet worked. Mainframes were like, you do something, it redraws the whole screen. Am I wrong here? Because that's what I've read.
They were on terminals, which is something I want to talk about in a minute. They were on terminals, and basically the way that worked is just keep scrolling the screen up until the old data was gone.
So there was a lot of wipe and refresh, but I think technology would have evolved even with a limited hardware, where it's like we're going to cache all these elements and put some programming in your house or in the computer you're on in your house, so that you're not having to reload all of this and process it remotely all the time.
So this is a perfect segue into something that I wanted to talk about. Thin computing, right? So if things were more like thin client designed like terminals. So what if instead of everybody having a computer connected to that ISDN line, we got a technology that evolved from 8-bit computers where they still was a giant mainframe and somebody else had the big computer, but all we had was a dumb terminal on our end, right? And
like in our home.
Like in our home.
Well,
right?
that's more or less what I had been envisioning is basically just taking like the terminals that we had that we ran on our computers in the 80s and say, well, if we had a 128K connection, we could probably have these terminals put graphics on the screen. We might even be able to have like a mouse pointer. I don't know. I mean, I guess there were mice back then. Wasn't popularized until a couple of years later. But anyway, point is, you could have had a considerably more advanced terminal that would run pretty fast. But all the computing would be happening somewhere else on some gigantic computer in some data center somewhere, just like we have today to some extent. That's exactly what I was imagining.
Got it. Okay.
But today it's a real mix, though. I mean, today we don't have thin clients anymore. The early days of the internet was thin client. It was more like the mainframe terminal model. Now we have this hybrid where anything that I want to keep secure, proprietary, or anything like that, or is just a really stuff like AI, like when you use Siri on your phone, the AI is not in your phone; it's making network call with Siri. Just awesome. Speak of the devil. But the AI is happening on Apple's end. But to your point, Facebook, all those little interactions and little bouncy pages and alerts and things like that is happening on a thick client on your computer. So we truly have a hybrid model today. And I'm just curious whether it would have stayed thin client, or it would have come to a hybrid model with, archaic
Well, I think
hardware.
you would have had to have some hybrid, to David's point earlier. Like you're not going to send the sound effects, for example, if you're playing some kind of online game or something, or if you have the ding that has to play for your new message came in on your 8-bit Facebook. Right. I think those things would have to have been done by the local processor. So I think it would have definitely been a hybrid environment.
Well, possibly. Think how much the early days of the internet, you were using less web applications and you had more installed desktop applications like your email.
Yeah.
All the little dings and stuff in your email were in the email program.
Yeah.
Right?
So in those days, and this is certainly something we should discuss here, but in those days there were kind of platforms like that. I mean, there was CompuServe, there was QuantumLink, and QuantumLink, for example, actually did have
All the way
local.
back in '82, they had all this.
Yeah, QuantumLink had to be out around that time.
Yeah.
And again, I'm
And even if it was a few years later, it still ran on the hardware of 82.
Right,
So,
right.
you know, yeah.
So it could have, it definitely evolved, right? Yeah. So so let's say that you've got QuantumLink. QuantumLink is an actual application that ran on your computer that then had an interface over your modem to get data from the I guess the QuantumLink mainframe. So that's actually a perfect example of.
I was actually
of what
thinking
could have
about
been
that
developed.
earlier. Yeah,
I'm really bummed that I didn't use QuantumLink. Like
I
I had
never
all
did
the
either.
disks and stuff, and I never used it.
I think I logged in once with some kind of demo account for a few minutes, but I never could afford to pay for it, so I didn't really get to. But they had online shopping on there. They had groups and chats and all kinds of stuff. So I mean, that's kind of exactly what I was thinking of. Imagine QuantumLink running on a faster connection. You could make that pretty good.
But QuantumLink was a mix of a thick client and thin client
hybrid.
technology.
You absolutely had to have the client software to use it.
Now I wanted.
As a matter of fact,
I want to use QuantumLink
I
somehow.
tried when I was a kid. I tried like all kinds of ways to try to figure out what the data was that they were actually sending over the modem because I wanted to try
Of course
to
you did.
hack QuantumLink. I never
Right.
could figure it out. I was too young. I was much too young to have the experience for that. But
So
today I could have totally figured it
I
out.
just have a list of some technologies that we kind of talked about earlier, and I wanted to see if various opinions on whether you think we could have these today. We already talked about social media. Mike had brought up MRI and CAT scans because these are CAT by its very nature means computer aided tomography. So and I think it requires a pretty sophisticated computer to be able to take all the data and turn it into something. So the thing is, I guess we'd have to Google it. We should have done that before the podcast. When did the first?
Yeah, well, okay, you Google it, and I'll make a statement about it while you're doing it.
Okay.
So I think the problem that is going to happen if we go down this path is that it won't be that we couldn't have done it, because I think probably the answer is yes. You probably could have eventually built some kind of CAT scan. I think the problem would be how long it would take to get the results. So if it takes the computer 6 months to calculate all the the pieces for it, then you're going to be dead of cancer long before you ever get the results of the test. I think would be the biggest.
Well, apparently it came out in the 70s, so I guess that question's already answered.
Okay, what do we know?
Let's
see, we don't know anything. Let's just cancel this podcast.
Yeah,
right now.
podcast over.
So I guess we'd still have that. Let me go back to my list here. So smartphones. I think we can all agree that smartphones would probably not be viable technology for a number of reasons, but you just wouldn't be able to fit that kind of processing power into the palm of your hand.
Yeah, so the problem with smartphones is going to be the processing power locally, like 100%, because not only just what it
And
does, the size, but it's also going to be around, like a lot of the things that made the iPhone and any of those devices is the like there's a chip on that phone, or it's in the processor now, but that does all the compression and stuff, and you couldn't do that like again with your 8-bit computer. So
I mean,
not be powerful.
Obviously, we had the little pocket computers of the 80s, and
You had the watch. I remember you had.
Yeah,
you did. I forgot you. The little watch was it a Radio Shack watch?
No, it was a Casio.
Casio. Okay.
Yeah.
Could you program in BASIC on that watch?
Nerd alert!
No, it was just a data bank.
Okay.
Although at the time I pronounced it Casio because I had never heard the term Casio said in public before. So for like
when you went to the store, the sales guy didn't say its name.
No, I don't think so. I would open catalogs and I would see, it's the Casio watch or whatever. It wasn't until, I don't know, I was probably in my late teens before I ever heard somebody actually say Casio.
I have done that so many times. Like my boss at my last job used to give me a hard time because I would say things in a weird way. So like when a certain Windows came out that had a Spanish sounding name, I called it Window Vista because in Spanish that's how you
Makes
would pronounce
sense, actually.
But everybody called it Window Vista, and like I called a bonsai tree a bonsai, which is actually correct. That's actually what you're supposed to call it. But Americans call it bonsai.
Oh,
it's actually
interesting.
Bonsai. And like I read stuff a certain way.
Yeah.
There's actually a guy I work with that anyway that he does the same thing. Like he'll say patronizing instead of patronizing, or
Well, he's just from London or something.
Right.
So, I had those little pocket computers, and in theory, we did have cell phones back then. Now, they were bulky and they were expensive, and whatnot. And it's possible that in time the price of cell phones would have come down some. I don't know if they'd ever get to the point they are today, but they would have probably come down some just with mass adoption, just because you'd be able to share the cost of the infrastructure between a lot more people. But so we already talked about broadband. Then we kind of touched on digital cameras. I think that digital cameras would be possible, but I don't think that they would ever be able to replace
analog, like
film cameras
film,
and analog video sources.
It's interesting. My youngest son is an amateur photographer, and he's gotten into analog film. Like he actually
that's coming back big time.
So one other thing I wanted to mention is like automobiles. Because like your current automobile, like your typical car these days has like 50 computers in it. They're all linked together on a CAN network.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we would have that because the computers would be too expensive. It would probably be cheaper. Like in many cases, like these days, they'll put a computer like in the back of a car to control like the taillights or something, because it's cheaper to do that than to run the extra wires back there to control each light. So I think they would probably still be just running the extra wires for everything and have a central computer. Because, I mean, some cars did have computers in the early 80s for engine computers and stuff like that.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
So, tell me and the other ignorant masses, what was a CAN network?
Oh.
It's just the network that's kind of standardized in most vehicles except for Tesla. I think Tesla actually uses Ethernet.
They do.
Oh, interesting.
But CAN network, what does that stand
CAN
for?
bus is
CAN
what
bus.
it's
Yeah, I don't know the exact specifics of the network, but it's just a computer network. I think it's real similar to ArcNet, if memory serves. I think I read that somewhere once.
Yeah, I can't remember. It's been I researched it one time, a long time ago when I was into cars, but I'm so far from that now I've forgotten most of it. But yeah, there's it's think about it as like a serial network all around your car that you can put data on the bus and then read data back, and
so you can hook something up to it and start like reading what your car is doing.
Yeah, and all the devices have addresses, and so it's kind of like an alarm, like your alarms have a very, very similar network where all the different sensors and stuff are on but anyway. Yeah, and then it's also one of those where you have to listen, and there has to be a big enough pause, and then you can throw data on the line. And
if you ever plug one of those scanners into your car, that's exactly what it's doing. The OBD2 scanner, it's interfacing with the CAN bus.
I've always wanted to do that, and I've never done it.
Yeah, it pulls all the data off of there. Yeah, that technology has been around for quite a while. I mean, the current the current implementation we have came out in 1995. It was standardized, required by the government by 1996. But they had earlier versions of that in the 80s. But yeah, the engine computers of like 1982 were extremely primitive. I think most cars at that point were still using what do you call those things that spun around to run the spark plugs?
Distributor.
Yeah, distributors. Yeah, stuff like that. So sometime in the 80s they started switching that over to computers to do that job. But yeah, I was just kind of wondering about like our infotainment systems and stuff that we have in the cars today. You could do it. It'd be a lot more expensive to stick it in there. Probably have to have a CRT.
Yeah, I really do. I mean, the more and more we talk about this, I do think that almost everything that we've talked about is certainly possible. I think cost would stop it.
Yeah.
Though. I think
cost and size.
Yeah. Unless something happened where they figured out, okay, well we can't make faster processors or whatever, that we can't make the chip smaller, whatever the technology limit was, because we didn't really define that. But I think unless they figured out a way to optimize some of those things, I just don't see the way that to cost reduce it.
I remember back in the 80s actually, and I want to say this was like 86 or 87. Yeah, because I think I was like 12 or 13 or something like that. And I remember, it would have had to been 86. That's when we bought that Pontiac Grand Prix. And I remember we went to the Pontiac dealer, and it was a GM dealer, and they also had on the lot there a Buick Riata.
Yeah.
And
that was kind of like one of my favorite cars back then.
And I was, I think it was in the showroom or something, and I was able to climb in there, and I wasn't even old enough to drive or anything, but I was so taken by the electronics in there because the dash was all digital. Now it was done with, it was in retrospect, I'd have to look it up, but based on what I remember, I would say it would be like a VFD display or something.
Yeah.
Kind of like what a Speak and Spell would use or something like that.
A bunch of
vacuum fluorescent.
glorified LED type.
Yeah, vacuum fluorescent. So it's what it would be. But in the center console, they had a CRT. Crammed right there in the middle, black and white CRT, and it was touchscreen, and it actually had touch controls on it, and you could operate everything from the radio to look at all diagnostic data and all kinds of stuff.
At home, I have an HP 110 or 115. It's one of the first touchscreen computers, and they were probably using a similar technology because there was no pressure sensors back then, but instead there was a grid array of infrared.
Yep, that's exactly what they used.
Yeah, you just tapped on the screen and it lost contact with the sensor on the other side of the infrared.
Yeah, there was basically 2 sheets of plexiglass that were spaced, just like 1/8 of an inch apart that were on the screen, and so when you touched it, it caused it to block the light between the sensors. Yep, that's exactly what they used.
But,
so we could have had touchscreen computing
in a car too, and around that time period, and so it's certainly possible. And I remember being so excited about that because I felt like, wow, this is really the future. The future has arrived.
And it really was kind of foreshadowing.
Yeah. So I have a funny story, and I'll keep it really short. But I have a funny story. I worked for I think they're out of business now, I know they're out of business now. But it was a company called Vandergriff Buick.
Oh yeah.
And I washed cars. It was one of my first jobs out of high school. And so every day I washed cars, and my favorite thing was like one a day somebody would buy a Buick Riata, and I got to drive it around and wash it. And so that was like my favorite.
Because you love that car.
Because I love that car so much.
You need to buy yourself that Buick.
No, I have no desire.
So one thing that I think is interesting, like I'm looking at the background you made here, and we've alluded to this, we haven't really talked to it, and that's since you didn't have a smartphone, we would probably still have lots of separate devices for things because you couldn't get things smart enough. So
that's true.
If you wanted to
take
home
that's
movies,
fascinating. I mean, you're so spot on.
Yeah, you'd have to carry a camera. Now, like maybe the cameras would get a little smaller, or they'd be a little, I don't know, have better sensors, or maybe there would be digital cameras. But you would still have to carry this thing around like we were doing, through the early 2000s. If you wanted to play music, you'd use a
music playing device.
A cassette player or something like that.
With a spinning CD in it.
Right. Well, with the CD, was that technology around in the 80s?
I think that was invented in like the 70s, I think, or something like that.
So eventually, because I remember people had big laser disc players.
David brings up, he's actually hinted at this a couple of times, and it's a fascinating thought. Much of the technology that we had in the 90s was actually invented in the 80s, right? Yeah. And it just took it a while to get mass market adoption and some of those things. And so there probably are some 90s technologies that we've kind of glossed over that would absolutely be applicable.
Right.
Because they would just refine that technology and get it mass market adoption.
Sony had the first Mavica, I think, came out in like the late 70s or something. And of course, it recorded to an analog floppy disk, but it did record, I would say they're not digital. I guess it was analog still images to a disc, so and that technology was even predates the time we're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, do you think we'd still be doing a lot with broadcast TV and radio since the again, since we would have maybe a computer in a closet or a terminal.
I don't think we would have any kind of streaming. I don't think so. Not for video.
I don't think we would have streaming video, but I tell you what probably would have come about because it was already starting to happen, and it would be you would have your regular television channels that would come over the broadcast or even the cable network, right? And they'd all be analog. But then there would be a digital overlay that you could get of data feeds. Like the shopping network might have like an app that you run on your Commodore 64 or your Apple II that would have where you could buy what's being shown on the show. You could do something like that, right?
Yeah. So, kind of combining the analog and digital TV.
And that was already like some of the stuff that in those days was like the shopping network, or what was it called back then?
Home Shopping Network.
I think they had a different name, but yeah, maybe that's it. Anyway, they already had stuff like that they were working on, so it just never got mass market adoption because the internet came along and blew it all away.
It's funny because just look at TV shows for a moment. Now, you take like Star Trek, the original series, their depiction of computers, maybe at the time seemed pretty futuristic, but even by the time we were kids, the depiction of computers
so outdated.
Were because even by the 80s, the Star Trek looked terrible.
It makes me wince every time, even up through Voyager, they would talk about the holodeck or a holodeck program and the subroutines were messed up, or Data's subroutines, and I'm like, computer programmers don't use subroutines anymore. We're not programming in 1980s BASIC. Like,
you're right.
But if we were stuck there, we might still be using subroutines, like, as an industry.
That's interesting, because some of the programming technologies, though, really don't have anything to do with the technology itself. It's just that we found better ways of organizing it, right?
Right. Yeah. And what I wonder is whether I would have the same career had we been frozen in the 80s, because here's why. And this is something, I'm going to get a little bit on a soapbox through this. So you, as a game programmer, programming on assembly, are really more of a computer scientist than I am. Like, you're much closer to the hardware because you still code in assembly and things, what we call low-level languages. Like, you were talking to memory addresses and instruction sets that are actually on the physical chip or whatever, or a particular chip, and you're addressing it through the bus or whatever. Ideal in abstractions, right? So when the internet started taking off and you got me the AST computer, and I started tinkering with web development and HTML and JavaScript and things like that, I don't know how to say this. The programming had been dumbed down enough for me to get interested in it. Like, I remember
That's awesome.
messing around with BASIC, and I would get so frustrated. And Commodore BASIC was terrible even for the time. But assembly was way too over my head for that time, for where I was as a 15-year-old or whatever. But by the time I was in my 20s, JavaScript and Cold Fusion and Visual Basic, I was like, I can get stuff done fast enough for me to stay interested in this and not get just completely burned out by it. And a lot of that is because the hardware allowed visual drag and drop elements. It allowed for things like object-oriented programming, which I know you tried to take a stab at OOP like years ago. I think you and I had this conversation, David, and you were like, I still don't get it. Like these class things and stuff like that. But it has these abstractions where you're not dealing with a particular memory address or an instruction set in a global list of variables. You're like, it's categorized, right? So it's my dumb brain. It's like, I don't want to worry about whether this particular variable overrides some memory address or something like that. Right. I want to worry about this small section of my code and this particular problem. And it's the programming language itself has isolated that from everything else that's going on in the computer. Even the operating system's like kind of abstracted away. Yeah. And that's a much safer, easier way. I
had a very similar experience because I learned assembler on the 8088 much after I had Commodores, right? Much later. I read, in fact, it was Peter Norton. I think I have the book in here somewhere, Peter. I know I have the book. Oh, there it is, right there. Peter Norton's assembly book. That's the one I bought when I was a kid. And I read that book, and I learned how to program on the IBM XT. And I did a little bit with it. I think I wrote a virus or two.
Sounds like you.
Yeah, some basic stuff like that. But I never really got into it because it was so tedious. It was so tedious, and it annoyed me. And when I really got into programming...
Your patience is amazing to write games and assembly.
When I really got into programming was when I got into, and a lot, I know you'll probably say it's not really programming, but when I got into HTML, when the internet came out, because I was making web pages, right? And it was because I could make something happen, like 5 lines of code, and boom, something changes, and I've got this beautiful thing on the screen. It was so easy, and I could make progress just fast. That's what did it for me.
Well, Greg, to be fair, all the development I do these days is on modern computers, and I'm using modern tools and modern compilers. The target system happens to be
right. So you do have some assistant abstraction.
But I do think though that if time had gone forward, like we would have still gotten languages that would have been easier to use.
Absolutely.
That would still have run at a decent speed.
Well, object orientation was, and I'm not saying that's the end all and be all of programming understanding. It's not, but it's helped a lot of people get into programming. That was, I want to say, the 60s or 70s when they came up with the idea about it. And what a lot of programmers, I think, did when they named like a label, like you wanted to jump to a label or something, they would kind of name something according to a bunch of categories. So instead of like now, if I'm trying to save a file, I may instantiate a file object, and then I've got that particular file, and I shove some text in it, and I would say file.save, right? I'm telling this particular file to go save itself, right? Mm-hmm. Back then, there just might be a function that's called file management _ file _ save, and then you pass it the data that you want to pass into it. I mean, it was kind of similar, but it was like all naming conventions. And now the programming language is just kind of hide that.
And I think I personally believe, and I would love to hear if there's any hardcore programmers in the audience, leave it in the comments. But I personally believe all of that stuff would have arisen. We would have just had, C, I guess C++, and then what's the object-oriented C came after that, I guess.
No, C++ was the object-oriented.
Yeah. Was that the object-oriented? So why does Apple call their C something different?
Theirs is Objective-C.
Objective-C. Sorry, I was getting mixed up.
And that was actually created by when Steve Jobs started his own company.
Next. Yeah, Next.
So if you've ever programmed on the iPhone, a lot of the objects were NS for next step.
Yeah. So I think that all of that stuff would eventually evolve onto the old hardware, again, because those things don't necessarily require technology. It's just a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah. I think they do, like the programming languages being more sophisticated sometimes does require more memory and more processing power. So I think it would have been OOP and scripting and things like that would have been drastically slowed down.
Yeah.
Here's where my soapbox is. So you mentioned C++, and this drives me crazy. If you're not a computer science, you're not engineering new hardware or things like that, or creating new languages, but you want to, like an MIS, like an information systems degree, right? What is the first thing they teach you? C and C++. When they teach programming, I mean, they do this in computer science too. So they start you off with this shit that would have bored me, like almost an assembly-like language. Like C is pretty primitive. And so they start you off with these primitive languages, and then they add more powerful languages. And I think we need to flip that, because how I got started is I used more powerful languages, got the concepts down, and then when I picked up a little Commodore 64 assembly just as part of my midlife crisis, I kind of enjoyed it. I was like, I liked the kind of primitive stuff because I understood programming well enough. So I don't know whether that our approach to teaching programming might have changed because of the need to be so cognizant of memory and power limitations.
I guess here's where my brain is around some of this stuff again, because I think of a lot of those things as more of the process and don't require the hardware. So David and I were talking to somebody yesterday, and we're talking about mathematical adding machines of like the early part of the century. Mm-hmm. And all of that was, there was like all these buttons on it, but when you pressed a button, there were like 400 things that happened mechanically inside that thing to flip bits and move them around. It was a mechanical computer. And so again, that doesn't require technology to make it happen. It's just a matter of knowing how all of those things and what order they have to happen. And I feel like a lot of the things with programming languages are the same way. Yeah, it might take 2 days to compile, but I think you could write the language.
Well, I was going to say, I think it would be safe to say if we were stuck in, computers running at 1 and 2 megahertz, that, all the games and stuff would still be written in assembly, at least all the good ones. But I think that there would certainly be a lot of, business development and stuff, like customized applications and stuff that are going to be written in a higher level language. And they would have evolved those languages to be better and better and better, and I'm sure, they would probably never perform like assembly would.
Sure,
but,
of course.
Well, it's telling that even today, people are still programming in C++ a lot for game development. Like even on today's modern hardware, there is more happening. Like with Unity, uses C#, and C# is kind of a semi-interpreted language. Like it compiles to MSIL, or it did back when I did it. So, as far as I know. Yeah. So it's definitely a higher level language than C or C++, but it's kind of the exception. Like the Unreal Engine is still C++ based, I think, and a lot of the gaming engines, the 3D engines are C++. Like that's what they're written in, because they need all that extra like efficiency to make cool games.
So I want to switch topics because there's one thing I put on the. I guess I have to turn it this direction. There's one thing I put on the two things, I guess, that I put on the background here that we haven't talked about, and that's there's a Apollo booster and a space shuttle that I put on here. We were doing space travel in the 80s, right? With those computers. In fact, we went to the moon with the computers of the 60s, right?
Right.
And so how do you guys think that space travel would have continued to evolve if our computers had been stuck? What would be different about, because certainly, I don't know if you guys have seen the inside of a SpaceX capsule.
Yeah.
It's like the Starship Enterprise, right? How would space travel have evolved?
Well, so just to be fair, the shuttle actually was developed in the 70s, and they actually retrofitted the cockpit in them. I want to say back in the 90s, early 2000s or whatever, and they called it their glass display or whatever, but it's basically...
They changed it to a 386 or something when they did that, right? Yeah, I think they
like
did.
That.
Which was still kind of behind the times.
But it had like color LCD screens and stuff in there, whereas the original 70s design had a whole bunch of green monochrome screens, and I think they were full of mostly just like text data. I don't seem to recall ever seeing any graphics displayed on those screens, but they worked for what they needed it for. Now, I think for human space flight, I don't think we really need anything more advanced than that. It's nice to have, but we don't really need it. But for robotic space travel, like sending probes to Mars and stuff like that, not to say you couldn't do it with the older technology.
We did. We sent Vikings.
Right.
And Odyssey, not
to say that we couldn't do it, but some of the things that we're doing now would be pretty darn difficult to do with that kind of technology, like the current Mars rover. And some of it just boils down to like power usage, and but also like the little flying helicopter, for example. Like the stability controls and all that. I don't know that you'd be able to fit a computer in that.
Some kind of 8-bit computer that could handle all of that.
It wouldn't be able to process the calculations fast enough to keep the thing balanced.
Right, and not be lightweight enough to actually be able to put it in there. So like drones and stuff like that we have today. Even for terrestrial use, again, you really need a pretty fast processor and lightweight computer system to be able to deal with all that.
Don't a lot of the drones and like you mentioned, like the rotary like correction mechanisms and stuff, isn't that is any of that AI trained? I feel like from what I've heard is kind of like the way space travel is going in the future is a lot of, because of all the space debris and things like that, there's a lot of AI stuff to predict where things are going to be.
Yeah, I know
all of that. Even though AI had been kind of invented in the 60s or 70s, we didn't have the power to do it.
Yeah, I know I watched some of the SpaceX videos, and they talk about how they're working on eventually having, the spaceships completely fly them. I know they do that already, but like I'm talking to the next level stuff, right? Where, oh, look, there's a big giant meteor or piece of space debris coming at me. I'm going to move out of its path. I know they're without a human being involved or flight control, and they're working on all of that. Drones, though, like I have a drone. Now it's 6 or 7 years old now, and so it's certainly not as advanced as some of the new stuff, but I think that's all just like tilt sensors and stuff, and it's like
just a feedback.
I'm tilting this way, add more propeller, right? I don't think there's any AI going on in there.
Of course, it's worth pointing out, if memory serves, and I have to Google this to be sure, but I seem to recall hearing that the current Mars rover, the new one, the big one, runs on a G3 processor, like basically like 1996 type processor.
Wow. It seems to me like the power usage of that would be...
Well, I don't think they run it very fast, but I think the main reason they do that is because NASA's got this long cycle for testing and getting stuff certified, and it takes like 10, 15 years to get a new chip certified, so they're going to use whatever's on the shelf that's already been certified. And so, yeah, they're using like a really old, like 25-year-old processor.
Wow, I did not know
cost, that. Like it has to be certified because they're like, I don't want to put this $5 million dollar rover.
Right. It has to be certified for a number of things, including radiation.
And heat and cold.
And heat and cold, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And so, and reliability, of course. And so... they're doing a lot of stuff.
That is fantastic. I'm going to have to go research that now. That is fantastic. I did not know that. Wow.
In space.
Wow. Well, I think that about brings us to the end of this one. Is there any other topics that we want to go over?
Yeah, I guess I just would like to summarize it by saying that it wouldn't be the end of the world if our silicon chips didn't improve any since 1982. I'm not saying it wouldn't it's certainly better the way it is now, but I'm just saying we could certainly...
You say that. You would still be happily programming games. I would be waiting tables, and nobody really wants that. That's awful.
But I think life wouldn't be as different today as maybe some people think it would be. Because, again, when we look at the 1980s, we're also picturing the culture of the time. We're picturing the education of the time when it came to what people knew how to do on computers and stuff like that. And I think,
and that is interesting too, because just because our ability to build a newer, faster chip doesn't mean our scientific knowledge wouldn't continue to grow, right? And we'd learn how to use those things in new and different ways.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, a lot of the difference between me and my parents and my in-laws and things like that is we talk about we're digital natives. We were born into a digital society on these older machines, and that so we were never intimidated by them. We kind of understood intuitively how they work because we were using them at such an early age. So picking up an iPhone or something like that is no big deal to us.
Right.
But to a lot of older people that did not grow up in that generation, they were the previous generation or two, it's all very just weird voodoo black magic to them.
I do have to tell you this, and I'm really sad to admit it, but the older I get, and I hate to say it again, but it really irritates me when they update my phone and change something that didn't have any business being changed.
Yep.
It's like you just slowed. It's going to take me 6 months to get used to this new damn workflow that wasn't even necessary.
Change for change's sake.
Yep. Now, when it makes something better or faster or easier, totally get it.
I have a hard time with any phones or computers or gaming systems just updating on their own because it's like I want to know what happen, and this goes back to when we were using computers, you were in complete control
of everything,
the whole thing. And now they just kind of do their things based on what the company is telling.
I have to tell you, I mean, so I use my computer at home for all kinds of stuff, video editing and all these different things, right? And inevitably, I leave a bunch of stuff up on the screen when I go to bed because I plan on picking it back up in the morning. And nothing makes me more mad at Microsoft or Apple is when I wake up in the morning and my computer spent 2 hours in the middle of the night updating, closing all my applications, probably didn't save any of my work.
But my biggest beef is, and this is something that you didn't have in the 80s, but the operating system updating when I'm trying to shut down. It's especially if you're on a laptop, you're like, I want to shut down and close the laptop and leave, and it's like, wait, I've got to spend the next 5 minutes updating. And it's like, no, I have something else to do. Or I want to reboot.
So I have a funny story for you on that exact thing, Craig. I almost missed a flight because of that. So I was going through TSA. They wanted to look at my laptop. I pulled my laptop out. The guy said, this was in Costa Rica. I was coming back to America. And the guy said, I need you to shut the laptop down and reboot it. I guess that somehow proved to them it was like a real computer. So I don't know. But anyway, I went to shut it down. And it's sitting there installing update 1, of 2, of 3, of 4.
And you can't opt
There's
out of
nothing I can do. I can't stop it. And I have to sit there, and we have to wait until the thing shuts completely down and boots back up. In the meantime, my flight's like, boarding, back to America. And I'm like...
You're waiting on Microsoft to update your computer on their time instead of your time.
Instead of my time, exactly.
That drives me crazy.
Yeah.
Don't waste my time.
Yeah.
I will tell you when I'm ready for you to do that.
Okay, well that wraps up this episode of the Geekbits Podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Yeah, good topic, David.
Yeah, absolutely. We're available on YouTube, Pandora, Spotify, and all of the other platforms, and we'll see you in the next episode.